izquierda.
A la izquierda.
Depende de donde se vea.
Así es. Sí, porque siempre depende de la perspectiva. Good evening.
Thank you very much.
Let me welcome all of you to this evening at the forum at the Kennedy School. We are very fortunate today to have with us Dr. Ernesto Cedillo, Mexico's Secretary of Public Education. Dr. Cedillo is a graduate of Yale University, where he received his PhD in economics. He has taught economics in Mexico at the National Polytechnic Institute and at el Colegio de Mexico. He has worked in the Bank of Mexico. He was Secretary of Programming and Budget under the current administration, the same office that the last two presidents of Mexico held before becoming presidents of Mexico. He, for the last year or so, has been Minister of Public Education, where he has had an opportunity to display the wide range of intellectual and public policy interests that have marked his career. He has worked a good deal on the decentralization of public education and has been able to implement it through the first important set of stages. He has been working as well on the significance of adult education and on the importance of technical and scientific education and research as well on those subjects. This evening, he will speak on the subject of preparing Mexico for the 21st century, focusing on the programs underway of educational reform, and he will take questions after his remarks. Dr. Cedillo, welcome to Harvard.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be here tonight in this forum of the John F. Kennedy School of Government. I would like to thank Professor Dominguez for his kind presentation. I would like to thank those that have made possible this meeting for this opportunity. It is an honor to visit Harvard University, since this institution enjoys a well-deserved international reputation for its commitment to excellence and its contributions for the advancement of science and culture. I sincerely wish that one day that reputation will be as high as that of Yale University. Tonight, I will attempt to outline Mexico's current educational reform, stressing its relevance to our country's development and the strategies to implement it. Let me start by putting into a more general perspective this topic and stressing to begin with that many nations are facing a very special dilemma in the field of public policy. The dilemma is how to combine a policy aimed at stabilizing and deeply restructuring the economy, while at the same time paying proper attention to social needs. This is, as I said, a very common dilemma many countries are facing. Indeed, Mexico has faced this dilemma while struggling to overcome the severe economic crisis that erupted in the early 1980s. As it is well known, the Mexican government began an ambitious process of economic reform in the mid-1980s, a process that has been deepened and conducted with great skill by President Carlos Salinas de Gortari since he took office in late 1988. This process of reform was outlined by President Salinas in his National Development Plan, which is a long-term domestic strategy that set forth the goal of achieving sustained economic growth, but with social development. To achieve that goal, it is well known that the Mexican government has been following a comprehensive strategy. Some of those components perhaps are well known to you. One of them, of course, was to embark in a major renegotiation of the external debt that was quite successful and reduced its size by about 20%. Another important component of that economic strategy was, of course, the reduction of the budget deficit that was a constant and a very threatening factor of economic instability during the 80s, and that was reduced from that huge deficit to a surplus situation in 92 and 93, thanks, of course, to expenditure cuts, tax reform, and also certainly the renegotiation of the foreign debt. Thanks to this and these orthodox economic policies, but also thanks to a policy by which we have reached a social agreement with unions, the agricultural sector, we have been able to reduce dramatically inflation. Only a few years ago, we were on the eve of hyperinflation back in '87, and we hope that this year we will achieve a rate of inflation less than 10%. Another important reform has been the internal deregulation of the economy. We have embarked in process of profound deregulation in the automotive industry, in the passenger transportation sector, in the trucking, mining, petrochemicals, telecommunication, technology transfer, agriculture, aquiculture, and financial services. We have also carried out an ambitious, and I would say a very successful program to privatize public enterprises. And that, on the one hand, has helped to improve public finances, but on the other hand, has allowed the government to concentrate on those areas of the highest social relevance. We have also had a process to liberalize foreign investment regulations, which has led to a record $10 billion level in 91 and to an $8 billion flow in 92. Also, a fundamental part of this strategy has been the liberalization of foreign trade. Mexico has evolved from being a very closed economy to be one of the most open economies in the world. Only a few years ago, we have, under quantitative restrictions of trade, 100% of our imports. And we had import duties in the vicinity of 100%. Today, almost no quantitative restrictions are placed in imports, but a minor portion of it, and the weighted average import duty is less than 10%. These economic reforms have already yielded concrete results. For 4 years, we have had a rate of GDP growth higher than the rate of population, which obviously is very contrasting with what happened during the 80s. And it has also to be observed that GDP growth has been already led by the private sector, which was not the case before. But more importantly, we believe that the foundations of an international competitive economy have already been laid down, and this has to be stressed. But as I started, one of the most striking features of President Salinas' strategy is that these policies designed to stabilize and modernize the economy have successfully been combined with ambitious programs to improve social welfare. Let me tell you that while we moved from a 16% budget deficit as a proportion of GDP to a surplus of almost 1% of GDP in '93, which is what we are expecting, we have moved from a proportion of social expenditure within the budget of 30% to a proportion of 53%. That's because we have been able to increase social expenditure in 80% in real terms. And this, I believe, is very striking, because we have been able to have a dramatic improvement in the overall result of public finances, while we have been able to increase dramatically the amount of public expenditure directed to the social welfare areas of government. You know about, perhaps about this social policy that has included the exemplary solidarity program designed to combat the conditions of poverty. But I should also stress that within the social policy, education has had one of the highest priorities. Of course, there is an explanation for this in historical, strategic, and social equity terms. Education, we all know, is a fundamental component for development. You will know that since the mid-19th century, education was considered as a basic right of every man and woman. Yet, around the 50s, a new conception about education emerged, and it was conceived not only as a basic human right, but also as a strategic factor for economic development. It is now widely accepted that education, or investment in human capital, if you wish, is a key variable behind GDP growth and a very efficient instrument to improve income distribution. Accordingly, President Salinas has emphasized education as a key priority for government policy, and has carried out, although rather recently, a very ambitious policy to reform education in Mexico. This reform, however, has to be put into perspective. It is not that Mexico had not been doing something important in education. In fact, this has been one of the major challenges for the Mexican government in the present century. We have to recall that only in 1921, when the Ministry of Public Education was established in Mexico, we were a country that only had, as average, 1 year of school in our adult citizens. We were a country that had an illiteracy rate of 70%, that only had a bunch of teachers and students, considering the size of the country that was of 14 million people. Today, Mexico has a population that is 6 times higher than it was back in 1921, the date I was referring before. Today we have 85 million people. But today the educational system of Mexico consists of almost 26 million students. Just to give you an idea, there are more than 100 countries in the world that have a total population which is less than the population we have in the Mexican educational system. And we have 1.5 million teachers, and we have more than 170,000 schools. This is very interesting because not only we have contended with an enormous gap that already existed at the beginning of the century in Mexico, but we have also contended with a very dynamic population growth. So this explains why education, in many respects, have been in the top priority in the Mexican government agenda. And the results the main results are that we have been able to increase the average school years to 6.5, from 1 to 6.5 over the 70-year period. Now the illiteracy rate is down to 12% from the 70% I was mentioning before. We are providing education to 90% of children of school age in primary school. But we are also very aware that we still have a tremendous task ahead. We have extended significantly the educational system, but we still have many children out of the school. We are very aware that we have very serious quality problems that have to be overcome, and we still have, like other countries, still high dropout and failure rates, and deep regional disparities, and certainly a serious mismatch between the output of the educational system and the requirements of the labor market. Undoubtedly, at least for the case of Mexico, the major challenge lies in what we call the basic education system, that is the preschool, primary, and secondary levels of the educational system. You might wonder why basic education? Well, the answer is very simple. First, for quantitative reasons. Out of the 26 million students that we have in our system, around 20 million attend basic school. But also, I should add the fact that both for the case of Mexico and for any country, it has been proved that the most profitable investment in education refers to investment in basic education, both from the individual and from the social point of view. Considering this situation in basic education in Mexico, it was thought that a major comprehensive reform was needed. It was conceived that an unprecedented reallocation of resources was needed, that a full set of programs aimed at expanding educational coverage was also needed, that we had to have a major reform in the curriculum to raise standards of quality, and that we have to improve textbooks, and that we had to make a tremendous effort to improve the teachers' training and salaries. However, it was clear that all of these changes would be fruitless if the whole system did not experience a deep reorganization, and that this reorganization had to have as a key component decentralization. After all, it has long been recognized that the most severe problem affecting the Mexican educational system was its extremely centralized and bureaucratic structure, which indeed obstructed and even opposed any positive change. We could have made many other reforms, but we did not have a structure that could assimilate positively whichever reform was undertaken. Therefore, a central issue on educational reform was the decentralization of the system. Because such a centralized system that we had before conflicted not only with the need to apply a deep and an effective reform, but also, and this I think is important, with the nature of Mexico's federal organization that is well established in the Constitution, but it had to be also put into practice in the educational system. Therefore, the decision was made to decentralize the system. This was not a new idea. Perhaps it was first considered back in the 60s, and it was attempted in several occasions, but was not really carried out. And the reason is very, very clear. Decentralization signifies a change of such magnitude that it poses a complex set of legal, financial, political, and administrative problems, and indeed raise all sorts of concerns. For instance, some fear that students would be exposed to chaos resulting from inexperience with the school management by state governments. An additional fear was class suspensions due to labor problems. It should be borne in mind that decentralization had to be negotiated with the teachers' trade union, which has a membership of more than 1 million people, enjoys a very powerful national organization, and is reputed to be one of the strongest and biggest unions, not only in Latin America, but also in the Western world. In addition, there was the risk of not convincing properly all 31 state governments of the benefits of assuming the management of an area in which they previously had only partial responsibility. After all, as I said, there have been other attempts that failed. These elements might explain why there were strong opinions favoring only a gradual process of decentralization. Others, including myself, firmly believe that a quick and effective decentralization had to be undertaken if basic education was to be reformed at all. Fortunately, this second option was chosen by President Salinas. The mandate we received in early '92 was to negotiate with the National Teachers Union and all 31 state governments a package of reforms, including the decentralization process. After a complex and intense negotiation, a national political agreement was signed on May 18, 1992, and the process of decentralization began. Let me tell you that it involved 100,000 schools, 13.5 million students, 700,000 teachers and administrative personnel, and a $7 billion budget for '93. And let me tell you that not easily, but it was fully carried out in only 7 months without losing a single school day. Perhaps this is a topic for students at a school of public policy like this one, but I think that this has been one of the largest, if not the largest, decentralization operations ever undertaken in any country. The new institutional framework that already exists allows for a more logical and efficient distribution of responsibilities between the federal and state governments. The federal government has retained the national authority to define the curriculum, a minimum set of standards, and the rules of operation, the national rules of operation. It has also retained the legal capability to evaluate the performance of state systems and individual schools. State governments have assumed the direct management of schools, but have agreed to transfer some responsibilities to municipal governments. Naturally, the political accountability of state governors in educational matters has proven to stimulate already educational improvement. I was just, during dinner time, commenting that a governor that just came to my office and informed me that thanks to a better administration, he has already saved enough money to have all of the schools in his states provided with new equipment. And this only after a few months that he took charge of the administration of schools. Mexico's choice has been a balanced pattern, granting both an efficient and rapid response to school needs at the local level, but at the same time having a set of national rules and standards. This is an important issue. Nowadays in Europe, for example, there's a big discussion about whether countries that have a decentralized system should have a national curriculum and a national set of rules to be followed by every school in the country. By retaining the national normativity in the federal authority in Mexico, we are combining a system that is decentralized from the administrative point of view, but at the same time, we retain the instruments to have national standards of education. Well, decentralization is certainly the key element of the reform, but we have other elements in that reform. One of them, which is very important, was the agreement to establish a new system of social participation in school matters. That is to say, to establish in every school in Mexico a council in which both teachers and parents are going to participate to follow the educational process. This might seem very obvious here in the United States, where there's at least the assumption that parents have to be present in the school, but that was not the case in Mexico. For historical reasons, had been a separation between parents and teachers' role in the education of children. And now we have agreed through this agreement that we should establish this kind of parents' participation in every school. This new organization, we believe that will allow other components of the reform to be much more effective. And let me stress a few of those components. One, we retain a firm commitment to continue increasing government expenditure in education. As I said, over President Salinas' term, real expenditure in education has been increased in almost 80%. Thanks to that, national expenditure in education, both public and private, which was 3.6% of GDP in '88, will be 5.5% of GDP in '93. And again, the figures show that basic education have got the highest priority. Throughout this period, real wages of teachers have increased around 60% in real terms. Another element of the reform has to do with the change in the national curriculum. Last year it was promised that a new national curriculum had to be introduced. We are now working on that, and the new national curriculum should be published during next quarter and will be fully introduced to schools over the '93-'95 period. Emphasis, as in many other countries, is being placed on a return to basics. That is to say, we are increasing the importance of Spanish and mathematics in the curriculum, and we are reforming the way in which these are taught in a school, emphasizing, as I said, the basic or the fundamental approach. Because of this reform, all textbooks for primary and secondary education will be renewed, including the 90 million textbooks for primary education, which are every year distributed by the federal government free of charge to students in Mexico. Another important element of this reform that was just achieved is a new national merit promotion system for basic education teachers that was launched only last January. This again involved a very complex and long negotiation with the National Teachers Union, and the new system includes periodic teacher testing, which did not exist in Mexico before, and systematic classroom performance evaluation of teachers. That is to say, thanks to this reform, teachers will be promoted not only on the basis of their seniority, but they will be promoted also on the basis of their preparation, academic preparation, and on the basis of their performance in classroom. Perhaps, from my point of view, this reform, this new merit promotion system might be the most important systemic change achieved in the basic education system in addition to decentralization. Another important component is the establishment of a national retraining program for basic education teachers. We started this program last summer. Its first phase was carried out last summer, and it is about to be instituted as a permanent program. Another important component of the reform in which we are working is a new system of national evaluation of educational achievement. This system will allow authorities and citizens to compare the performance of the educational system at the school, municipal, and national, state and national levels. Another important element of the reform is a constitutional amendment proposed by President Salinas and already approved by the Federal Congress, to make education compulsory up to the secondary school level, that is to say, up to the 9th grade. We have compulsory education only up to the 6th grade before. Another important element is that while we have been decentralizing education at the federal government, this federal government is now in the capacity to implement special compensatory programs to improve educational levels in the most disadvantaged groups and regions of the country. They were basically started after the agreement was achieved last May, and we have already started with a program to improve primary education in the 4 poorest states of Mexico. We have now a program to improve the performance of the most disadvantaged schools in every state. We have an initial education, or how it's called here in the States, a Head Start program for poor rural areas in 12 states, and a program to reduce by 1/3 the illiteracy rate by the end of '94. And we also have a program, of which we are very proud, which we call Children in Solidarity, which is a program that provides poor children with scholarships, health care, food allowance, and other benefits so as to enable them to attend a school. So this is what we have been doing in primary education, in basic education, but of course we know that an important effort has to be made in other levels of education. I would limit myself to make a brief mention of 3 areas. One is vocational or training or technical education. We believe that a full reform of the public vocational training system is needed, and therefore we have been working on it over the last few months, and we hope that in a short period of time we will be able to make public this reform. The reform, I can anticipate, will emphasize the teaching of basic working skills, the raising of academic quality in those schools, the retraining of unemployed workers. We want to bring unemployed workers back to school to be retrained. We emphasize the support of firm-sponsored training programs and the teaching to trainees of modern technologies and flexible capabilities for problem solving and decision making. Another area that needs a reform is, of course, higher education. In that respect, the government has been working with autonomous universities, which is the dominant presence in our higher education system, and has been working to persuade them to adopt and achieve higher academic standards and link their activities more directly to the needs of the economy and the society. In this case, we have to be very respectful of autonomy of universities, and we have been doing is to link only part of the subsidy channel by the federal government to the performance that they make in these aspects of the reform. In the meantime, however, government subsidies to public universities have increased by 40% in real terms since President Salinas took office. Finally, I should say something about science and technology policy. The cycle of education will not be complete if we did not pay attention to this important area. And here we have also had a dramatic shift as a result, of course, from an inward-looking to an outward-oriented development strategy. I should stress only a few elements of this new policy. It has involved, of course, an increase in public resources for research and development of almost 70% in real terms since '89. We have reorganized the whole system of public science and technology institutions, establishing or giving one agency all of the coordinating responsibility to achieve policy consistency and avoid duplication of efforts, but at the same time, securing freedom of choice for research projects. We have introduced a process of competition among potential recipients of public funds for science and technology, and the systematic use of a peer review process to assign funds among competing projects and evaluate their progress, rather than a bureaucratic approach as we had before. The new science and technology policy also stimulates the application of the matching funds principle that is very common in the state but was not in Mexico, particularly in technology projects. We have improved economic incentives for researchers, and we have been strengthening the infrastructure of research centers and universities. I should say that some of the results are already present. For one thing, we believe we have stopped the brain drain that had been occurring during the 80s, and even we have been able to attract foreign researchers into Mexico. And we are starting to see a wide range of linkages between research institutions and the productive sectors of the economy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, current trends toward economic restructuring focus on the globalization of production and markets and the liberalization of economic forces. This process, as we all know, is leading to a new international division of labor among countries, in which an essential characteristic is the growing importance of education, scientific research, and technological change. Undoubtedly, they are and will continue to be decisive factors for development. We know well that a nation, a country will succeed in world competition only if it can create the necessary environment for innovation and the availability of highly specialized engineering and a skilled and educated labor force. Aware of these realities, Mexico is ready to face the future with a renewed sense of hope. Our deep cultural roots and our history have given us a strong national identity and a special pride in the achievements of past generations. It was in Mexico that the first printing press, the first university, and the first arts academy of the New World were opened. Our civilization has roots reaching back to more than 30 centuries, deserving international recognition. We want our future generations to live up to that heritage, to preserve and strengthen our national sovereignty in the new global and independent environment. The Mexicans of today have committed ourselves to attaining increasingly demanding standards of economic performance, social well-being, and a shared faith in democracy and justice. Through educational reform, President Salinas' government is working today for the prosperous, democratic, and independent country we are determined to be in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cedillo. We now have some time for questions. Let me remind you that if you would like to ask a question, you should walk up to one of the microphones and line up. When you do ask a question, I hope it is brief and that you say your name and that you then say one sentence about yourself, if you're an undergraduate or a graduate student or someone from the community, so that Dr. Cedillo has an opportunity to know who is asking the question. Let me ask just a question of my own. One of the interesting and creative and difficult problems is how to coordinate national standards and decentralization. And I wonder if you could say an additional word, not only about the decentralization of responsibilities, but about the decentralization of resources. To what extent is it possible for a state government or a municipality to reallocate the use of economic funds in the schools, and to what extent might it be possible for some of the new parents' councils in the schools to affect some of the policies that would be carried out in the schools. In other words, not only to support what goes on, but to affect the direction of educational policy at the local level. So one has to do with economic funds. The other one would have to do with substantive issues in the teaching of children.
Thank you. Well, the agreement achieved with the state governments was that the federal government would transfer to them whatever resources it was using to support schools under its management. And that in the following years, to that resource base, the increase in the general federal budget will be applied to the budget being transferred in '92 to state governments. That will be the permanent contribution of the federal government to the state budget in education. That, of course, will permit that those governments with the capability of doing it will put more resources into education. This indeed will be a force of differentiation among state educational systems. But you have to see that into the perspective that at the same time, the federal government will support compensatory programs for those states that have the most disadvantaged conditions in education. Now, regarding this parents' participation in a school, well, participation has to be made both to support the educational process of children and to supervise that the objectives of the educational process are being accomplished. As I said, in Mexico we have opted for the national curriculum model and the national normativity of the system, and therefore it will not be up to every school to design its own rules to conduct academic subjects in the school.
Begin over here.
Yes, my name is Roberto Trujillo. I was training in Mexico as a medical doctor, and part of my training I did in Baylor College of Medicine, and currently I am a doctor in science candidate in bioimmunology. My question for you, Dr. Cedillo, is the plan, but during the process of education, the time that there's a new reform and the time that goes to the application to each student has several steps. From that steps, what do you think is the most difficult to accomplish, or what could have more problems, and how you feedback these kind of problems?
Well, I would say that the most difficult structural aspect of the reform, which was decentralization, is already accomplished. But you are right, there are other aspects that have to do more with the academics that are being introduced and will pose certain difficulties. One particular point is introducing the new curriculum. And in that aspect, your question comes very well. What will be the main obstacle to introduce the new curriculum? Well, the main problem will be to retrain teachers to use the new curriculum. So in that respect, it is a necessity, indeed, to have this national retraining program for teachers. But there is a happy coincidence that we needed that program anyways, and that we are going to apply it when precisely we need to introduce the new curriculum. But still, it poses a tremendous organization problem that we just tasted last year. We hadn't had before a program by which we provided certain training to teachers of an homogeneous nature at the same time. The last time, all teachers in basic education in Mexico were trained on the same subject or set of subjects was in the early 70s, when we had 1/5 of the teachers we had before. And in order to cover all teachers, it took us about 2 years to give them 2 weeks of homogeneous training. Last year we had to do it simultaneously for 900,000 teachers, and we do it during the summer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senor Ministro, my name is Sherry Merritt-Wagstaff. I'm from Minnesota, and I'm here at the Kennedy School learning about public policy and children's issues. I also have a question that relates to curriculum. In Mexico now, you're faced with more than 10,000 people who've been affected by the AIDS epidemic. And in our country, it's been very difficult to introduce education, preventive education into the schools. And I'm wondering, in Mexico, what do you see as the greatest barriers you're facing right now to introducing AIDS curriculum into the schools? Who do you see as your allies, and what have you been able to accomplish thus far in the schools in terms of AIDS preventive education?
Well, we see it as a more general subject. We call it education for health. That's the approach. It has proven, as in many other countries, to be a very touchy, difficult issue. And one of the advantages of having these councils within the school with simultaneous participation of parents and teachers is precisely that we will have a non-central, a non-authority way of introducing this kind of education. And we leave parents and teachers simultaneously the responsibility to introduce these topics into the education of children and young people. And of course, we have to provide the materials, as we did last year in this retraining program for teachers. In coordination with the Ministry of Health, we produce a number of little textbooks for teachers so that they could give those elements to children on health matters. I believe that that's a way to do it. If you want to have a good process that is not interrupted by certain groups that oppose that kind of education in schools, then you have to work with parents so that they assume at least part of the responsibility.
Thank you.
Dr. Cedillo, hi, my name is Eric Conaton Espino. I'm from Mexico City, and I had two questions, but first let me say that I must say that I admire some of the reforms that you are doing, and that I think that they will help Mexico. But there's two concerns that I have. One of them is in Mexico City, I know that when you have the big periods of contamination, you in the public schools, school day is reduced to almost like 2 hours a day. And also there was a report by United Nations that was saying that there was at least a certain level of mental retardation of the students in Mexico City.
Of what, sorry?
That the United Nations made some report saying that there was some level of mental retardation of students in Mexico City. So my first question is, what is the role of the Ministry of Education in addressing the problems that contamination is causing in education, public education? And then my second question is, you're saying that 60%, there has been a 60% increase in real wages for professors, teachers in public education, in like elementary school and higher education. But however, I personally know professors both at university level and the elementary school level that say that they're not paid enough. So there's this brain drain away from public schools into private schools. And my second question is, what is the Ministry of Education trying to do to keep good professors in the public education system so it can help educate Mexico?
Thank you. Well, first let me tell you that this policy of having less hours of schools because of pollution has been suspended. Simply because it had no logical sense. For some reason that I don't understand, people believe that if children enter school later, they will be better protected from pollution, especially during the winter time. I still don't understand how they arrive at that brilliant conclusion. I realize, since I arrived in the ministry, that right after, and let me tell you that there were many people that were proposing to suspend classes in the winter and have them in the summer, whatever. And that it would be better for the health of children to keep them out of school. Well, I realized that every time that there was a vacation period in Mexico City, we will have a very high rate of absentees in the school. So I went to schools and tried to find out how children were not attending right after a vacation period. Because in the public system, we cannot conceive that those children were spending that vacation in Acapulco or in Vail, Colorado skiing. It's obvious that they were not doing that. Well, what I found was the children were sick because they were not at school. Because by not being at school, they were staying outside in the parks, in the street, and they were getting sick with the cold and with pollution. So I decided that we will suspend that former rule and that from now on during the winter, except when we have the environment contingency plan, which is another stage of the problem, we will have a regular time schedule for children, and that will be the best way to protect their health, having them protected within the school. The other question that you raised about salaries, well, you are right. Wages have been raised during the last few years, but clearly that has to be improved. That's why we have a policy to continue increasing public expenditure, and part of that should be directed to improve earnings of teachers.
Mr. Cedillo, my name is Jose Tello, and I'm an undergraduate here at Harvard. My question for you was, there are many secondary school students who find it very hard to continue professional school, and I think for two major reasons. First, due to a lack of economic resources, and also a lack of jobs for people who do finish professional schools. So I was wondering what kind of incentives and programs the government is doing to alleviate these problems?
Well, the educational sector can hardly contend with the immediate social problems that affect certain aspects of education. I mean, you cannot contend from the educational sector in the short run with the poverty problem, and many children and young people drop out of school because of poverty. So that's, we have to have a consistent and complete strategy, development strategy to contend with that problem. Although there are many things that can be done within the educational system to improve that situation. And one is to improve the quality of education. Another is, of course, to have special programs to support poor students, like we are doing in primary school, with this solidarity program for children that we have already 1 million students protected by this program. Now, the other aspect of your question is very interesting. Well, there are many young people that graduate from professional schools and end up unemployed in Mexico and in many countries. Well, that refers to the problem I mentioned on the serious mismatch between what is produced in school and what is demanded in the labor market. Somehow we have to have an educational system that is more responsive to the needs of the market. That's very clear. Well, one way to do it is, on the one hand, to have more opportunities for people to have vocational or technical training right after they finish secondary school. And that's the reform I was talking about. And the other way is to work with higher education institutions so that we can make them more concerned about producing professionals that are needed by society. So we have to look for mechanisms of linkage between universities and the market, and we are doing that.
Dr. Zedillo, my name is Juan Carlos Aguirre. I'm a grad student in the Grad School of Arts and Sciences. My question is, you addressed the reforms you're advocating for in policy in the Ministry of Education, very much in terms of the world current towards a globalization process. I was thinking also, parallel to that process, there's one which is readdressing the specificity of being different, that of ethnicity that in the last couple of years has also become major in this modernization rethinking, specifically towards policy in Mexico. And after the government finally recognized that Mexico is a pluriethnic and plurilingual society, will that affect this rethinking that you are currently advocating for? Are you considering modifying those policies that were established within your ministry by Vasconcelos in the late 20s, which are quite racist in terms of exclusively making Spanish the language of Mexico and only allowing the languages of the indigenous groups to be instrumentally used towards the learning of Spanish? I would like to know if some rethinking about that has been done, and now that constitutionally we are a pluri-ethnic society, what are the prospects for the indigenous populations of Mexico in terms of this new era of education, for them to have a better education too?
Well, first I would like to make a clarification. I don't think we have to undertake an educational reform simply because we are participating more in the global economy. I think we will have to do that anyways. I have been having interviews with colleagues of mine from all over the world, and I am very surprised to find that this concern about education and the way in which it's being reformed in many countries in the world is shared by people as different as the Cuban Minister of Education, the Chilean Minister of Education, the US Secretary of Education. That is to say, we have to have a big concern about education irrespective of the model you are following to achieve development. So I wouldn't say that this educational reform is especially urgent or obliged by the participation of Mexico in the global economy. I would say that under any circumstance, in any country, education has to have the highest priority. Of course, if you are participating or trying to participate in the global economy, you will be able to obtain better results if you have a better educated population. Because nowadays, the competitive advantage of nations is very much determined by the quality of your human resources. And that's a very simple reason why we have to emphasize on the economic arena the importance of education. The other aspect is that the other clarification is that perhaps you are not quite aware of what Mexico has had in terms of bilingual education for many years. To begin with, Vasconcelos' policies were not applied in the late 20s, they were applied in the very early 20s. And I don't think you had made a very fair characterization of what he did back then. I think one of his main achievements was to launch a national campaign to reduce dramatically the illiteracy rate, which, as I mentioned before, was 70% back then. But I don't think he really had a policy to exterminate other languages in Mexico. In fact, Vasconcelos initiated what is called the rural school approach to education, which was an approach that was quite respectful of the forms and ways of living of the communities, and that was inherited into the system of Indian education that we have had in Mexico for over 3 decades. And there is a very extensive system by which we educate the Indian population, first by making them literate in their own language before, and then we move into Spanish. This is a very widespread policy that we apply not only in the basic education system, but we also apply in the adult education system in Mexico. And of course, we have this reform in the Constitution, Article 4 of the Constitution you were referring to, but I would say that even if that reform was applied, the country was spending a lot of resources in its indigenous or Indian education system. I hope you have the opportunity to know it more closely and have an opinion, a very qualified opinion on that aspect.
Thank you. My name is Dennis Lopez, and I'm from San Diego, California. One of the things I noticed as I was growing up along the border in San Diego, and I continue to observe as a professional, as an educator, is for Chicanos here in the United States, we continue to suffer under a lot of patterns of dropout or push out of high school, and few numbers in the colleges and universities, and certainly fewer numbers among faculty and universities throughout this country. However, as a young person growing up along the border in San Diego, and as an educator, I have observed that Mexicano students here in the United States have had for Chicanos, for Mexican Americans, a profound and positive influence. There are many Mexicano students here in the United States without documents who have a right to a public school education by United States Supreme Court decision. My question to you is to what extent you may be able to use your influence with your counterpart in the U.S. Department of Ed or with the President, President Clinton, in perhaps, and I would hope, advocating for residency consideration, at least as far as the states can control, for these young people who are products of the United States public school system to be able to further their education in college, given that for all intents and purposes they may stay. And finally to say that indeed they do have a profound and positive influence on Chicanos here, Mexican Americans that are here born in this country.
Well, I think we have a role to play. I do believe it. In fact, in some particular communities we have been playing that role. The Mexican government has established in some cases agreements to provide material and teaching support to make Mexicans literate in Spanish, because once they have as a native language Spanish, it's very difficult to make them literate in English if they are not literate in Spanish. So in some communities in California and in Texas, we have been having these, I would call them pilot programs, to support with our elements the educational process. Now, it's not easy. First, well, because we have a limited capacity to do it, but also because of the nature of the educational system in the United States, we don't really have a clear counterpart to negotiate or establish a major support program, because the national authority really doesn't have authority to conduct local educational systems. So all of the agreements, in fact, have to be established with local authorities. And it's very hard to go, one community after the other establishing or promoting this kind of programs. However, we have expressed to the U.S. government our willingness to cooperate in whatever we can do to support this kind of programs. And let me tell you that only 2 days ago I had a meeting in Mexico City with Raúl Izaguirre and with Gloria Molina, with Antonia Hernandez, and we talk about this. And they promise that they will be more specific in pointing which areas of the United States should receive or should be considered for this kind of cooperation between Mexico and the United States. We'll be meeting very, very soon to continue this kind of analysis.
I just fear that there are elements in the United States that are attempting to expel the children K-12 if they're not U.S. citizens. So I think the level of discussion has to go to protecting Mexicanos here in the United States as well.
That's right.
Good night, Dr. Cedillo. I'm Carlos Contreras. I study here in the business school. And I was wondering, there are some countries that have a screening process in order to have a better return on the expenditures on education at all levels, at elementary school, secondary, and university. And have any practices like this been considered in the reform? What are the options that you consider, and which one did you choose?
I'm sorry, would you?
It's sort of a screening process, like, different exams at different levels, elementary school, secondary school, and in order to increase the return on the expenditures that the government does on education.
Well, we have a systematic system to evaluate students' performance in every year in Mexico, as in most systems. Yet, we do not have a system that systematically compares performance between schools, either at the local or municipal or state level. That system of evaluation is used internally in every school simply to promote students. What we have considered in this reform is a national system of academic performance by which we will apply national examinations and have this information to evaluate the performance of each individual school. That perhaps will be useful for the purpose you have mentioned.
Dr. Cedillo, my name is Manuel Jaime. I'm from Mexico City. I'm a senior in mechanical engineering at MIT. And throughout my undergraduate career at MIT, I've seen a very high level of participation of industry in research in science and technology. And my question to you is whether any programs have been developed to increase the level of participation of industrial firms in Mexico as far as research in science and technology goes, both in the public and in the private sector.
Well, I think you have to tackle two aspects. One is the lack of interest that you usually see both in university professors and researchers towards private industry. There is historically little interest of academia in Mexico to look for the private sector in order to obtain some support. In order to tackle that aspect, which I think is very worrisome, we have established the matching funds principle for the federal government supported technology projects. That is to say, we will provide financing for projects oriented towards the technology areas only if they can match by a certain amount of private funds. By doing this, we are somehow forcing people in the academia to look for support in the private sector. And as I mentioned during my presentation, we are starting to see some of these, an answer to this problem. The other aspect is to convince people in the private sector to look at universities as a very useful source of talent, knowledge, ingenuity to solve their problems. And perhaps more generally, to create a new conscience in the private sector about the importance of acquiring modern technologies. And this is a task that we are starting in Mexico. It is not an easy one. It is going to take us time, but we have just started.
Thank you.
Thank you. Isabel Londoño, a Colombian graduate student at the School of Education. Ministro Cedillo, most countries in Latin America have experienced a lot of difficulties implementing decentralization of education, and most of those processes have taken longer than they have thought. And I would like you to comment on the key issues of the strategy that you use to implement decentralization that have made it resulted in a much shorter period for implementation and a successful implementation.
Well, the first element is to take the decision to make it quickly. As I said, there was this discussion that it should be made gradually, very carefully. And the other opinion, which advised to make it in a rather quick manner. I think that's the first decision. So you have to have a plan to make it very quickly and to tackle at the same time all of the complex problems that it involves. You have to be able to solve practically at the same time whatever legal problems it may pose, whatever administrative problems it may pose, and of course whatever political problems it may solve. So you have to have a very careful plan done well before you are going to tackle decentralization. You cannot wait until you make the announcement that you are going to make decentralization and then start working out the details. In fact, let me tell you that it was made public in Mexico that we were going to make decentralization only the day that it was announced. There was no a leak in the press before that. We were having negotiations, very intense negotiations with the teachers' union and with the local governments, and there are a very clear understanding that this was not going to be made public before we reach an agreement. And when we reached that agreement and it was made public, the Secretary of Education had already worked out a complete plan to execute the many actions that had to be executed to achieve decentralization.
Hi, Dr. Cedillo. I'm Franz Elizondo Schmelkes. I'm a Mexican student at MIT from Querétaro. I'm curious about the expansion and improvement that you mentioned in basic school in Mexico and higher studies. Something that you didn't mention that I would like to know more about is what is being done to the expansion and improvement of art institutions in Mexico. And my other question is, has to do also with the Chicano and Mexican community in the United States. If is there any effort being done by Mexico to educate the very large population of Spanish-speaking people in southern United States in higher studies, like, I don't know, something like a Tecnológico Regional of Vista Ley or something like that, that might be needed for all those people that want to go on higher studies in their own language?
Well, I cannot tell you much about the U.S. educational system for two reasons. One, because I don't know much about it, and two, because I'm not authority in that system. What I can say, as I said before, the Mexican government is quite willing to cooperate in any program that increases the probability of success of a Mexican-born or Mexican-American student in the United States, if any of the elements that we have are useful. Now, regarding higher education in Mexico, well, you know, historically, the federal government has supported very strongly higher education. Proof of it is that only 20 years ago, we only had 250,000 students in higher education, and today we almost have 1.5 million students in higher education. That is to say, we have a system that only in 20 years had multiplied 5 times. We only had a bunch of public universities 20 years ago, and now we have almost 40 autonomous universities funded by the federal and the state governments, and we had 100 higher education technology institutes spread all over the country. Well, in terms of coverage, I would say that the policy is to continue channeling more resources, promoting new institutions, but from now on we have to be very careful also in paying attention to quality. Because sometimes in higher education the problem is quantity, but it's also quality.
Sorry. Okay. Okay.
Good evening, Dr. Cedillo. I'm Javier Laruc. I'm a Mexican student at MIT from Mexico City. And my question has to do with the decentralization process you were talking about. I would like to know if, aside from the administrative and financing changes, the government is implementing changes to the curriculum or the concepts that are thought to better address the needs and the characteristics of specific regions or states. And if it is doing so, what would the government still try to convey as to the characteristics of Mexico as a whole entity and its validity as a national state?
Very interesting question. Well, as I said, we are retaining the concept of national curriculum in two respects. One, there will be a mandatory national curriculum for every school in Mexico that by law is going to be decided after consultations with the community and with the teachers, with teachers and researchers by the national authority, that is to say the Secretary of Education. But one innovation that we are introducing is to assign a portion of the school curriculum for the regional curriculum. That is to say, we will allocate a certain percentage of time, of teaching time in a school for the teaching of the local curriculum. And that curriculum will have to be developed by the state authority, although it will have to be presented to the national authority to supervise it. We believe that by having this system, we will be able to retain those elements that are important to keep and reinforce national identity, but at the same time we will open a space to have in the school system reflected the regional, the very rich regional, ecological, geographic, historical diversity that we have in our country.
Our time is up. I'm sorry that there are more questions, but it's a tribute to your remarks, your willingness to answer so many questions, and your very informative and thoughtful remarks. Thank you very much, and thank you all.
Sí, el agua hay que tomarla.
Sí, porque